Hey, RetconRaider here. Today's video is dedicated to Mike Spark and Mildly Nuclear. Thanks for your support, guys. That said, let's get started. Okay, so it's been quite some time since my last update video, but that's for a pretty good reason. Aside from Backer Build 4, which released back in March, there just hasn't been all that much to talk about. For better or worse, Snapshot Games has just gone very quiet this year, starting back around late January when they stopped updating the official dev roadmap, and continuing all the way up until their recent appearance at E3. All things considered, they've only released 3 official updates over the past 6 months, with the only major update being the one focused on Backer Build 4. That's not necessarily bad, but it's certainly a very jarring change of pace, considering that back in 2018, we were seeing almost 3 times as many official updates, plus a truly remarkable amount of extra teaser material released through ArtStation accounts, the Discord server, and through various social media platforms. In comparison, the reveals we've seen this year have definitely been less impressive, primarily focused on material that we already got to see back in 2018. While it's certainly understandable that Snapshot Games would want to keep some of the bigger reveals reserved for major events like E3 and Gamescom, it still feels a little odd, especially considering that we're just 2 months from the game's intended release date. That said, this is something that the Snapshot devs have finally decided to address. For example, Kevin Hill recently explained that the main reason the development roadmap stopped getting updated is because the employee who handled it left the team sometime back in March or April. She has since been replaced by a new head of marketing, but he's had his hands full getting up to speed with the company's current ad campaigns and social media. Similarly, things have pretty much ground to a standstill where the fiction of Phoenix Point is concerned, most notably with last year's fanfiction contest pretty much fading into obscurity. This is something else that was recently addressed, with Snapshot's QA lead confirming that they are still hammering out the final details. In theory, we should be getting a look at the winning entries sometime in the very near future, which should hopefully shake loose a little more in the way of lore for us to analyze. Really, from the sound of things, the devs over at Snapshot have just had their hands full trying to get Phoenix Point ready for the rapidly approaching release date. Just because we're not hearing about the development on a regular basis doesn't mean that things aren't still happening behind the scenes. Granted, this is still pretty frustrating, especially after we were essentially spoiled by the sheer volume of concept art and teasers they were releasing last year. But thankfully, as of E3, this does appear to be something that Snapshot Games is hoping to change. Speaking of which, I suppose E3's as good a place as any for us to start with. Now, I'm not going to lie here. I did find Snapshot's recent presentation at E3 to be a little underwhelming. After a solid month worth of build-up, their presentation primarily ended up focusing on a new cinematic trailer, a slightly updated version of Backer Build 4, and about a half dozen new interviews, none of which really gave us much in the way of new information. To be fair, though, it is important to note that things like the new trailer and interviews were never really aimed at people like me in the first place. After all, I've already bought into the project, and I've spent the past 2 years putting it under the microscope. Although their presentations at E3 ended up retreading a lot of familiar ground, I think it's pretty obvious that it was more intended to attract new potential buyers, essentially hooking them with a fancy trailer, and then reeling them in with a condensed version of everything we've been talking about over the past couple of years. The one big reveal that was rather noteworthy was the game's official release date, which is slated for September 3rd. I'll admit, that's actually a lot sooner than I had ever imagined. I was really expecting another delay, or at least something closer to the very end of September. Aiming for September 3rd is definitely a very ambitious move, maybe even too ambitious. But the developers seem pretty confident, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see. That said, let's talk about what we do know about this impending release. Now, obviously, Snapshot Games made the rather contentious decision to become a timed Epic exclusive back in March. There's still some bad blood there, so we won't really dwell on it. Suffice to say, the PC version of the game will initially be launching through the Epic Games Store. In a bit of a surprise move, however, the game will also be available on PC through the Microsoft Store as well, coinciding with its simultaneous release through the Xbox Game Pass system. Phoenix Point will remain exclusive to these 3 distribution platforms until September of 2020, at which point it will also be released through Steam and GOG. Backer pledges and pre-orders placed before the March 2019 cutoff date will receive both an Epic key at launch, as well as their choice of either a Steam or GOG key once the exclusivity period is ended. Although specific details are still scarce, Snapshot Games are also planning a fairly aggressive schedule of additional post-launch content. Aside from unspecified free content updates, they'll also be releasing at least 3 pieces of major DLC during the first year, starting with the floating Phoenix base and underwater mission stretch goals, and ending with a 3rd, as of yet unrevealed, piece of non-cosmetic DLC. Much like with the Steam and GOG keys, these first 3 pieces of DLC will be free for anyone who already placed a pre-order before the cutoff date back in March. The developers will also be releasing a 4th piece of DLC, the Alien Living Weapons and Chitin Armor Pack, but that one is a bit of a special case. Because it was part of the original crowdfunding campaign, it will be free to anyone who backed or pre-ordered the Platinum edition of the game or higher. While it's still too early to really nail down the details on the expected system requirements, Snapshot's QA lead did recently share a rough estimate of the benchmarks they're currently aiming for. Just like last time, I'm not really much of a tech guy, so I'll just put the listed details up on the screen so you can take a gander at them yourself. But it is worth noting that these are still subject to change. At the very least, we still haven't seen much in the way of gameplay optimization. And at the end of the day, the developers are inherently limited by the hardware available in the current Xbox consoles. And now we come to the bad news. Like I said, aiming for a September 3rd release date is a very ambitious goal, and it's starting to sound like it's one that can't be achieved without making a few sacrifices. That said, let's move into the somewhat nebulous realm of cut or otherwise removed content. Now, take this with a grain of salt because, as always, we don't really know exactly what's going on over at Snapshot Games. However, during his recent interviews at E3, Julian Gollop seemed particularly hesitant to talk about certain details of the upcoming game, most notably hedging on things like the number of planned classes and the inclusion of some pretty significant content, such as the massive city-destroying behemoths. This obviously raised a few eyebrows, ultimately prompting Kevin Hill to later clarify that the behemoth is still in active development. The developers just aren't sure if it will be ready in time for the planned release date in September. If it is, then it will still be included as planned, but otherwise it will be held back until they do feel that it's ready for inclusion, at which point it will be released for free as part of their already planned post-launch support. On a similar note, Kevin Hill also recently confirmed that certain units teased throughout 2018, such as the new Jericho Mech and the Disciples Beast Rider, also wouldn't be making the initial cut. Unlike the Behemoth, however, he stressed that these were never part of the original design document, so there's no guarantee that we'll be seeing them as post-launch content. If they are added, it's far more likely to be as part of a future DLC pack, rather than a free content update. Of course, that's all something to worry about a little later in the year. A more immediate concern is Backer Build 5, which, in theory, should give us a much better idea of what the launch version of the game will look like. Although the developers obviously haven't been able to put out backer builds nearly as frequently as they originally planned, they have at least confirmed that we should be receiving one more build before the game's launch in September. Although just as vague as usual, Kevin Hill recently stated that we can probably expect to see the final build roughly 1 month before Phoenix Point's full release. What's more, he also implied that Backer Build 5 will essentially be feature complete, meaning that all the essential mechanics will be in place, but not necessarily all of the content. Snapshot Games has always been pretty straightforward about how the backer builds would never include much in the way of story or endgame content. Sadly, that's the sort of thing that we'll just have to wait until September to actually explore. One of the things we are likely to see are the final 2 in-game factions, Sanhedrion and the Disciples of Anu. Disciple Havens actually did make it into Backer Build 4, but only in a very limited capacity, with no actual faction-specific units, and only the Slums tile set to explore. More recently, one of the 3D artists working on Phoenix Point revealed a small sample of some of the other structures we might encounter in a Disciple stronghold, most notably featuring a massive, intimidating temple in the background, which is very reminiscent of some of the game's earliest environmental concept art. Another rather prominent reveal was the updated character model for the Disciples' Mutog unit. These mutated dogs have been teased as far back as early last year, but they've gone through some significant visual changes over the past few months. The brand new, updated model that was first shown on Twitter in late May presents us with a much larger, bulkier creature that seems more likely to serve as a heavily armored powerhouse, rather than the light harassing or flanking unit that the earlier concept art implied. The original plan was that these creatures would be controlled by special disciple units known as Mutog Handlers, which the Phoenix Project could actually acquire from the Disciples through trade or treachery. Although we don't know if the Mutog Handlers are still planned for the final game, we do know that Mutogs will have multiple possible mutations, making them a more unpredictable threat on the battlefield. Another rather intriguing reveal is our first scrap of information about the mysterious Priest class, which Julian recently talked about during an interview with IGN. This elite class will be exclusive to the Disciples of Anu, and will apparently possess the ability to take control of weak-willed enemy units. This will go hand in hand with another new reveal about the Disciples of Anu, which is that they'll make use of virus-based weaponry. Although we have previously heard that they'll also make use of an assortment of melee and low-tech ballistic weaponry, this is the first time we've actually heard about them weaponizing the Pandora virus. A tangentially related subject is the Disciples' mutation-based tech tree, which will allow them to deliberately mutate their soldiers, much in the same way that the Pandora virus can mutate its own units. Although the details are still hazy, recent hints over on Reddit have indicated that these mutations are essentially specialized pieces of equipment that can be permanently attached to different parts of a soldier's body. While they will grant the soldier new abilities or passive bonuses, these mutations will not come without a cost. Aside from permanently altering the soldier they're attached to, mutated body parts may also inherently limit the type of equipment that soldier can use. Of course, while these mutations will initially be exclusive to the Disciples of Anu, Snapshot has repeatedly stressed that this is technology that the player can also get their hands on. Much in the same way that New Jericho will have superior weapons and armor, and Sanhedrion will have superior drones and scientific devices, these are all technologies that the player will be able to acquire. According to Snapshot's QA lead, this is actually what will help set the player-run Phoenix project apart from the other three factions. The Phoenix project will actually be the only faction capable of not only acquiring tech from multiple research trees, but they'll also be able to essentially combine these different research projects into strange and unique new hybrid technologies. This, of course, is just one of the many ways that the player will be able to shape or customize the Phoenix project. For example, while we can already rename our soldiers in the current builds, the latest official update gave us our first real glimpse at some of the planned cosmetic options. Similarly, it's also been reconfirmed that the developers are planning to include audio barks in the final game, which may provide yet another way to further customize the player's units. One of the other items prominently showcased in the most recent update is the game's updated destruction physics. Although we've already seen a partially implemented version of the planned destruction system in Backer Build 4, the new footage shows us a system where things like structural support and durability have also been implemented. That means that in the final game, not only will objects have varying durabilities, with some being easier to destroy than others, but it also provides even more tactical options on the battlefield. For example, more realistic destruction physics will allow the player to theoretically demolish entire buildings by just taking out the right support beams or load-bearing walls. Beyond that, things get a lot more vague. One thing the developers have been very tight-lipped about is the game's planned stealth system, which they still bring up from time to time. Sadly, aside from the placeholders in Backer Build 4 and the recent confirmation that they've added Fog of War to their internal build, we just don't have much to go on at the moment. Like I said, the devs over at Snapshot Games have been pretty quiet lately. So a lot of the bits and pieces of information that we do get tends to be fragmented or focused on very minor mechanics. A lot of what we've been hearing revolves around things like basic combat balance or gameplay optimization. These are the sort of things that, while potentially interesting to the particularly hardcore fans, aren't really worth dedicating an entire segment of the video to. That said, one last thing I would like to touch on are a few of the rejected concept renders that Georgy Pepelinov recently uploaded to his ArtStation account. The Siren is one of the several enemy units that has undergone significant changes throughout the game's development, with the most recent version being a massive humanoid centipede. These variants, however, generally retained a more humanoid shape, as well as a significantly more exaggerated frame. It's obviously a rather drastic departure from some of Georgy's other recent designs, given that he also handled the in-game models for things like the Chirons, the Sentinels, and even the Technician's Sentry Gun, all of which were featured in previous backer builds. Sadly, as of Backer Build 4, it sounds like Georgy is no longer a part of the Snapshot Games development team, so it's entirely possible that these more recent uploads are just the result of a former concept artist having a bit of fun in his spare time. Oh, but that does remind me, we also recently saw some new uploads to Lars Cornelius's account as well. We've actually talked about him before. He's the concept artist who's been handling a lot of the environmental designs for the Phoenix Project and New Jericho Havens. While several of these images may look somewhat familiar, there are actually a couple of new ones in the mix. And even the older ones have actually been updated with some subtle new detail work. Now, that actually brings me to one last little tidbit of information. Something which actually has no bearing on the release version of the game, but which I still thought was interesting enough to share. Specifically, we already know that Phoenix Point is going to be a purely single-player experience, something which was essentially promised as far back as the original crowdfunding campaign over on Fig. However, Snapshot's QA lead recently revealed that the very first prototype of the game did in fact have multiplayer support. Given that the developers have actually been working on Phoenix Point for over 3 years, this original prototype would actually predate the original Fig campaign, before the prototype build that we saw back in 2017. According to Strife Cross, there were just too many inherent problems with trying to implement the destruction physics and ballistic simulations in a multiplayer platform. That, combined with studies showing that many players simply didn't like turn-based multiplayer strategy games, would certainly go a long way towards explaining why Julian Gollop ended up deciding to focus on a single-player experience instead. And that's pretty much it. 3 months worth of updates, condensed into a 20-minute update video. Oh sure, there are still a few things I skipped, such as some of the recent promotional art, or some of the very minor teasers. But really, like I said, that's generally stuff we basically already saw back in 2018, so it's not really worth showcasing here. Thankfully, with the game's official launch just 2 months away, it sounds like we should hopefully be getting some much more substantial reveals over the next few weeks. Who knows? By this time next month, we might have our hands on Backer Build 5. And I think that's something we're all looking forward to. Until then, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Phoenix Point, you can find out more about the game by visiting the official website, the official YouTube channel, the official Discord channel, the official Facebook page, the official Twitter feed, the official development roadmap, or the original crowdfunding campaign over on Fig. You can also still get your hands on the latest backer build by pre-ordering the game over on the official Snapshot Games web store. As always, links are in the description.